A bell strikes softly in the distance, its echo weaving through narrow streets wrapped in fog. Lanterns flicker against stone walls, their light trembling as footsteps fade into silence. This is hidden traditions of night watches in medieval cities, when guards patrolled in darkness, listening for danger, whispering prayers, and carrying rituals long forgotten. Some believed shadows held spirits, others trusted only the steady rhythm of bells. You don't need to follow every word. Just let the images drift. Subscribe and tap the bell for more calm history. Tonight, uncover the secret life of cities that never truly slept. Asterisk, the first thing you notice is sound. Not the chatter of day, nor the cry of a marketplace, but the measured rhythm of boots against cobblestones. Slow, steady, echoing through streets emptied of trade and laughter. A staff strikes the ground with each turn, wood against stone, a warning and a comfort at once. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, then falls silent. The fog thickens, folding over roofs, pressing into alleys, muting even the sound of bells. And yet here, in this silence, footsteps continue. If you're still listening, you don't need to follow every detail. Just stay with the echo, the mist, the way the sound grows softer, then nearer again. In the cities of medieval England, night was not left unattended. When darkness fell and the gates closed, watchmen took to the streets. Their duty was simple, but endless. To walk, to listen, to guard. Theirs was a world not of brightness, but of hush. A city transformed from noise to murmur, from color to shadow. Candles still burned in windows. Hearths glowed in taverns. But beyond those circles of light, the watch moved in silence. Picture a narrow lane. The stones are wet, glistening faintly in lamplight. A watchman passes, his breath visible in the cold air, the iron buckle of his belt catching the glow of his lantern. You hear the rattle of his keys, the dull thump of his staff. The smell of tallow smoke lingers as he passes, carried on damp air. Behind him, the silence folds back in, as if swallowing his trail. If you're still listening, you don't need to follow his route. Just rest in the rhythm of his footsteps, the pause of his lantern, the stillness that returns after. The night watch was not only practical, it was ritual. The city entrusted its silence to these men, expecting them to protect against fire, theft, or unrest. In some towns, they cried the hours aloud, voices echoing through empty streets. 10 o'clock, and all is well. The words reassured sleepers, letting them know that eyes remained open while theirs were closed. Imagine hearing that call through the shutters of your chamber. The voice, distant yet clear, carrying both warning and comfort. The flame of your candle dips low, the blankets heavy on your shoulders. Outside, someone keeps walking. You don't have to remember the words themselves. Just let the call drift through the air, fading into silence, then rising again from farther down the street. The tasks of the watch were varied. They checked doors, ensuring bolts were drawn. They sniffed the air for smoke, for in crowded wooden towns, fire was the greatest enemy. They listened for footsteps where none should be, for voices raised where silence ought to reign. And sometimes they stood still, lantern lowered, breath quiet, listening for the faintest disturbance, carried on fog to imagine the stillness of such a pause. A watchman halts at a corner, the lantern's light barely reaching the far side of the street. He leans on his staff, eyes searching shadows. The fog presses close, damp against his face, muffling even the sound of dripping eaves. For a moment, all is still. Then, with a long breath, he moves on. It's the sound of his boots returning to mark time once more. If you're still listening, you don't need to know what he thought. Just follow the hush, the pause, the return of rhythm. Yet not all nights were calm. Festivals, riots, sudden fires. These too fell under the watch. Candlelit processions could wind into chaos, their flames spilling onto thatch, their songs shifting into shouts. Taverns could boil over into fights, their doors spilling men into the street. In those moments, the watchman's staff was more than a symbol. It was authority, wielded to restore order in the shadows. Picture a clash outside a tavern. Lanterns swing wildly, light scattering across cobbles slick with ale. Voices rise, rough and heated. Then the staff strikes stone, sharp and commanding. The glow of a watchman's lantern cuts through fog, his voice firm as he steps between. The air smells of beer and smoke, the chill biting through wool. Slowly, voices fall, fists unclench, and silence returns. The flame steadies, the fog folds in again. If you're still listening, you don't need to follow the quarrel. Just rest in the image of flame steadying, of noise fading, of night reclaiming itself. But beyond duty, the night watch carried a quieter tradition. It was believed that those who walked at night carried not just safety, but memory. They knew the city as few did, the way fog gathered in alleys, the places where silence deepened, the sounds of shutters creaking against frost. They became custodians of unseen hours, keepers of knowledge that belonged not to daylight, but to shadow. Picture a man walking his watch for the 20th year. His beard is gray, his staff worn smooth. He knows each crack in the stones, each corner where the wind changes, each sound of doors being drawn late. His lantern light has fallen on 1,000 walls, his breath misted into 1,000 frosty nights. For him, the city is not only stone and timber, it is silence, shadows, and the endless folding of fog. If you're still listening, you don't have to remember his years or his steps. Just drift in the thought that the city itself seemed alive to him, whispering through its silences, watching through its shadows. And so, the tradition of the night watch was more than patrol. It was a ritual of presence, of reminding the city that it was never fully abandoned to the dark. Even when shadows grew deep, even when fog swallowed every outline. The sound of boots and the glow of lanterns marked the endurance of order. Night belonged not just to sleep, but to those who stayed awake within it. Picture the final image of this section, a narrow medieval street. It's a fog dense, the silence heavy. A single lantern swings at the side of a man walking slowly, his staff tapping the stones. Above, windows glow faintly, candles burning low within. The air smells of wax, of damp, of smoke. The night folds close, and yet it is held open by the small rhythm of footsteps. It's a fragile glow of flame. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to remember the names of towns or the duties of men. It is enough to feel the hush, to drift with the glow, to let the footsteps fade into silence. And yet a question lingers as the flame bends low, as the fog presses thicker, when the footsteps stop, when the staff falls quiet. What remains of the silence they once kept? Asterisk. The night folds thicker now. You hear the fog pressing in, softening edges of stone, wrapping wooden beams in damp silence. A lantern glows faintly in the mist, its halo trembling, its light barely holding back the dark. You hear the watchman's breath, see the small cloud of it rising into the air, then vanishing into the haze. His staff touches cobblestone again and again, but the rhythm is slower now, more hesitant, as though the night itself listens back. And in such moments, when the air is still and the silence too deep, whispers take shape. You don't need to follow each word. Just let the murmur drift past, the way fog drifts through a street. For those who lived in medieval cities, the night was never only darkness. It was also a realm of spirits, omens, and things unseen. Watchmen carried not only staffs and lanterns, but also the weight of superstition. In a time when medicine was uncertain, when sickness could arrive with no warning, when fires could rise from embers and take whole streets within hours, people believed the night carried warnings, and that those awake to hear them might glimpse what others could not. Imagine a watchman pausing beneath the tower of a church. The bell above him is silent, its shape lost in the fog. He leans on his staff, the lantern low, when suddenly he hears what sounds like a cry, a thin wail rising from the mist, then falling into silence. He waits, breath held, but the street is empty. Was it a woman in distress? A cat? Or was it something else? An omen, perhaps, of sickness soon to spread, or a death not yet known. You don't have to decide. Just rest in the echo of the cry, the silence after. The way the fog folds tighter. In some places, people believed that spirits roamed most freely during the night. Watchmen, walking their routes, claimed to hear footsteps beside them, though no one was there. Others spoke of faint lights moving across rooftops, not lanterns, but wandering souls, flickering as they passed. There were even tales of ghostly processions, entire lines of shadowy figures crossing empty squares in silence, seen only by those on duty while others slept. Picture a watchman standing at the edge of a square, his lantern lifted high. The fog parts only slightly, enough to show a row of figures moving across the stones. Their shapes are dim, their outlines uncertain. He calls out, but they do not answer. His staff strikes the ground, the sound ringing hollow, and still the figures pass, vanishing one by one into haze. The square is empty once more, save for the smell of damp stone and the sound of his own heart. If you're still listening, you don't have to know whether those figures were real. Just let the image drift, the lantern glow, the moving shadows, the return of silence. Shadows, the return of silence. Superstitions shaped how the watch worked. Some believe that carrying certain charms protected against spirits, a sprig of rowan, small cross carved of wood, or even a piece of iron tied to the belt. Others thought that the ringing of bells kept the unseen at bay, which is why some towns demanded the watch call out the hours, not only to reassure the living, but to keep away the dead. Each cry, 12 o'clock and all is well, was not just information. It was a ward against silence, claimed that the city was guarded against more than thieves. Picture those words echoing down a narrow street. The sound rises, firm, then fades into stillness. A few windows open, shutters creaking, as listeners take comfort in the call. But others whisper prayers as well, murmuring softly to themselves, crossing their foreheads in case something more than men listen to. The sound lingers a moment longer, then is swallowed by fog. If you're still listening, notice how the echoes fade. You don't have to follow the words, just follow the sound fading into stillness. Legends grew around certain nights, the winter solstice, for example, or the Feast of the Dead. On these nights, it was said, the boundary between worlds was thin. Watchmen sometimes returned with tales of seeing pale forms wandering graveyards, of hearing music when no musicians played, of smelling strange scents carried on still air. Some claimed that when the city slept, the dead rose to walk paths they once knew, leaving faint traces only the watch perceived. Imagine passing through a graveyard at midnight. The stones are damp, moss glistening on their edges. Your lantern throws small circles of light, but beyond, the mist is thick. Then, faintly, you hear a song, not loud, not near, but drifting on the air. A melody you do not recognize, played on no instrument you can see. You pause, the flame trembling in your hand. The song lingers, then fades. Only silence remains heavy and close. If you're still listening, you don't need to decide where the song came from. It is enough to drift with the echo, the hush that follows. Even animals carried meaning. A dog howling at midnight was not just noise, but a warning of death to come. A crow flying by lantern light was an omen of unrest. Watchmen knew these signs, or believed they did, and they carried them like burdens. Each sound in the fog was a message, each silence a question. To patrol the night was not only to guard against men, but to interpret the language of the unseen. Think of a watchman leaning against the wall of a tavern, his breath curling in the cold. From the shadows, a cat darts past, black as soot. He shifts uneasily, for some believe such a sight means misfortune soon to fall. Still, he raises his lantern, the flame steadying, and walks on. Behind him, the silence folds once more, and the alley is empty. You don't have to keep each omen in mind. Just drift with the lantern glow, the fleeting shadow, the hush that returns after dot. And yet, despite the fear, there was comfort in the watch. For even when spirits were imagined, even when cries were unexplained, the steady movement of men through the night gave reassurance. They marked time, carried presence, and held the line between order and uncertainty. The night belonged to them and to the mysteries they carried. Picture the final image for this section, okay? Watchman standing on a bridge, the river below hidden by mist. His lantern casts a weak glow on the water's surface, which shifts and ripples in silence. He listens to the lapping of waves, to the faint creak of timber, to what might be whispers or only wind. Around him, the city sleeps, but he remains awake, eyes searching the fog, ears tuned to the unseen. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to hold the stories of omens or songs. It is enough to rest in the hush, the lantern glow, the endless folding of mist. And yet, as the lantern trembles in the wind and the watchman leans on his staff, one thought lingers. Were they guarding the city from danger, or guarding it from the silence itself? The night deepens. You hear the creak of wood settling, the distant splash of water against stone. The air is thick and cool, carrying the faint smell of damp earth mixed with the sharper attempts of smoke that lingers even when no fire is in sight. A watchman passes by, his lantern casting slow circles of light on the cobblestones. He taps his staff against the ground with a steady rhythm, a sound meant to remind those hidden in sleep that someone still wakes, someone still listens. And yet, the true dangers of the medieval city at night were not always spirits or omens. They were closer, more immediate, and they burned, stole, or shattered lives with little warning. You don't need to hold on to every detail. Just let them drift, like sparks rising from a fire before dissolving into the dark. Fires in the night for those living then. Fire was the greatest threat. Cities built of timber and thatch, packed close with narrow alleys and overhanging roofs, could be undone by a single flame. A hearth left smoldering, a candle knocked aside, or even lightning striking from above could bring entire neighborhoods into ruin. And so the night watch became not just a guard against thieves, but a shield against fire. Picture the sound of a crackle in the dark. At first it is faint, only a whisper of burning wood. A watchman lifts his head, nostrils flaring at the sharp scent of smoke. His lantern trembles as he moves quickly, staff striking stone faster now. The glow appears ahead, orange, flickering, small but hungry. A pile of straw has caught fire, licking at the wall of a stable. He cries out, his voice carrying through the night, and other watchmen rush toward him. Buckets are filled at the nearest well, chains of hands passing water one to another, each splash hissing against flames. The fire dies, leaving only smoke curling into the sky. The street glistening with water, the silence folding in once more. If you're still listening, okay, you don't need to picture the whole scene. Just notice the hiss of water on flame, the faint glow dying into darkness, the city returning to stillness. In some towns, watchmen were required to check every household after dark, ensuring fires were banked and candles extinguished. They would pause at doors, knock softly, and sometimes even step inside, guided by the glow of embers. For many, this intrusion was not resented, but welcomed, for everyone knew how quickly flames could spread. The watch, in this way, was not only protection, but prevention. A quiet agreement between those awake and those asleep. And yet, despite their efforts, fires still came. Whole districts burned in silence, broken only by screams. Church bells tolling frantically, and the roar of wind feeding flame. When morning came, little remained but ashes and stone. For watchmen, such nights left shadows that lingered in memory, nights when their lanterns seemed useless. their shouts swallowed by the roar of destruction. Imagine standing at the edge of a burned street. The air still smells of smoke, bitter and sharp. The ground crunches beneath your boots, fragments of charred timber breaking with each step. A blackened beam leans across the path, still warm to the touch. Around you, silence is heavy, broken only by the distant call of a crow. If you're still listening, notice how the silence after fire is deeper than before. You don't need to hold the images, just drift in the quiet that follows. Thieves in the dark. The second danger came on softer feet. Thieves who slipped through the night like shadows. In cities without street lamps, where alleys, twisted and corners hid what the lanterns could not reach. Robbery was always near. The night watch was tasked with patrolling against these figures. Though the line between watchman and thief was not always clear. Some who patrolled by day stole by night, while others turned a blind eye for a share of the spoils. Picture a narrow alley, walls leaning close, the smell of rot rising from barrels left to fester. A man slips through the shadows, his feet silent on damp stone. He lifts a latch quietly, pushing at a door. Inside, the faint gleam of metal catches his eye. A candlestick, a tool, anything worth taking. But before he can move, the sound of a staff striking stone echoes nearby. The thief freezes, breath held. A lantern glow spreads across the mouth of the alley. Closer, closer. Then it fades again, the watchman passing by. The thief exhales and melts deeper into shadow. If you're still listening, you don't need to follow him. Just drift with the image of lantern light receding, leaving darkness behind. In some places, thieves carried knives, ready to cut purse strings or throats if needed. In others, they worked in groups, one distracting a watchman while the other stole. The watchmen were often poorly paid, their coats thin, their lanterns dim, and so they were not always able to stop them. Yet their presence alone, the sound of staffs, the calls of the hour, the sudden flare of light was enough to scatter many crimes before they began. For those sleeping inside, the sound of the watch was a lullaby of safety. Each call of the hour was not just a mark of time, but a reassurance that shadows were being watched. Yet for others, the sound was unsettling, a reminder that danger was always near, and that safety was fragile. Imagine lying in bed beneath a low roof, the straw mattress rustling beneath you. Outside, you hear the watchman's cry, 3 o'clock and all is well. His voice carries, then fades. You close your eyes, but the words linger, both comfort and unease. For what if, in the pause between calls, all is not well? If you're still listening, notice how the sound of the call drifts away. You don't need to worry about its meaning. Just let it dissolve into stillness, the fragile sleep of cities. The fragile sleep of cities. In the end, what the night watch guarded was not only buildings or goods, but the sleep of the city itself. For in darkness, every sound magnified, the creak of a cartwheel, the cry of a newborn, the bark of a dog, all carried through the silence, reminding sleepers of what lay outside their doors. The watch was the thin line between order and chaos, between rest and fear. Some nights were peaceful, the watchmen walking their rounds without interruption, the city holding its breath in quiet harmony. Other nights were restless, filled with shouts, fires, or the sound of blades clashing in shadowed alleys. And always, morning came, the bells tolling, shutters opening, and life returning as though the night had not been filled with danger. Picture the first light of dawn touching the stones of a medieval city. The fog lifts slowly, revealing rooftops damp with dew. Smoke curls from chimneys as fires are lit anew. Watchmen lean on their staffs, weary but relieved, their work passing into memory as the city wakes. Their lanterns are extinguished, their cries of the hour silenced, replaced by the sound of voices, carts, and bells. Yet, in the quiet moments, they remembered the night, the shadows, the whispers, the dangers faced in silence. If you're still listening, notice how time slows again. You don't need to carry the whole history of the watch. It is enough to rest in the hush of dawn, the fading of lanterns, the slow return of light. And so, the hidden traditions of night watches in medieval cities were not only about order, not only about safety, but about the fragile boundary between sleep and survival. Watchmen walked that boundary every night, their footsteps marking the rhythm of time, their lanterns holding back the endless dark. But one question lingers softly. Even as morning rises, when the watchmen called the hours, were they speaking to those who slept? Or were they reminding themselves that they were still awake? Asterisk, you hear bells tolling faintly, their bronze notes rolling over tiled roofs, softening as they echo through narrow streets. It is night in Renaissance Florence, though much of the city still feels medieval, a place of stone walls, winding alleys, and hidden courtyards where shadows linger long after the sun has set. The air is cool, carrying with it the mingled scents of river water from the Arno, the faint sweetness of wax from burned candles, and the acrid smoke of wood still smoldering in hearths. You notice how the silence is never complete. A dog barks somewhere, its sound bouncing between walls. A cartwheel creaks as it is pushed into storage. Footsteps shuffle, careful, deliberate, and then a voice, firm, resonant, practiced. The call of the watch. 2 of the clock. And all is well. The sound stretches into the stillness, reassuring some, unsettling others. For in Florence, the night watch was never only about guarding against thieves. It was about politics, conspiracies, the fragile trust of a city where power often shifted as quickly as the shadows. You don't need to follow each detail closely. Let it drift past, like ripples of water sliding away from the banks. The silent dangers of the Arno for those who lived in Florence. The river was both life and danger. The Arno carried trade, powered mills, gave water to dye houses where vivid reds and deep blues stained cloth destined for far-off markets. But at night, its banks were places of whispers. Smugglers slipped silently into the current, their boats brushing against reeds. Lovers met where lanterns did not reach, and sometimes bodies were found there at dawn. The current pulling secrets downstream. Picture the sound, slow water lapping against stone. A lantern flickers on a bridge, its flame bent by the wind. Below, 2 men pull a boat against the current, their oars barely breaking the surface. A watchman leans over, his staff in hand, peering into the gloom. His lantern light wavers on the water, but reveals nothing. He steps back, footsteps hollow on the bridge, and the night closes in again. If you're still listening, you don't have to see the boat clearly. Just hear the water, steady and calm, as if time itself drifts downstream, because Florence was more than a city of artisans and merchants. It was also a city of rivals, noble families whose alliances and betrayals shaped politics as much as any law. And when conspiracies brewed, they often did so in the shadows of night. The watch, then, was both protector and spy. They carried lanterns not just to find criminals, but to mark who walked the streets when others slept. The guilds and the watch in Florence, as in many Italian cities, guilds held power. They controlled trades, defended privileges, and paid for the defense of their quarters. And so, the night watch was not only civic duty, but also guild responsibility. A weaver might guard one night, a banker another, a goldsmith the next. You can imagine the sound of their boots on stone. Not the firm tread of professional soldiers, but the uneven steps of men unused to night patrols. One clears his throat, nervously. Another hums softly to keep himself awake. Their lanterns swing, throwing uneven circles of light against rough walls. If you're still listening, let the glow of their lanterns drift in your imagination. You don't have to picture their faces, only the soft light moving between shadows. By day, these men worked in shops filled with color and noise. Wool dyed in vats, coins struck with hammers, gold shaped into delicate designs. By night, They walked silent streets, their hands tied around staves, ears straining for every sound. It was said that the Guild Watch was as much about discipline as defense, a reminder that even the powerful must serve their city in humble ways. Yet, Guild watchmen were not always vigilant. Some nodded off, leaning against doorways. Others drank wine to chase away the cold, their voices too loud, their laughter echoing where silence should have been. And in those moments, real watchmen, hired for pay rather than duty, took their place. Moving silently with the lantern's steady eyes sharp. Fear of conspiracies, Florence lived under constant tension. Behind the beauty of its art and architecture lay rivalries that cut deep. Families such as the Albizzi, the Strozzi, and the Medici fought for power. At times, a whispered plot in the night could change the fate of the city by morning. And so, the night watch was not only about guarding streets, but about listening for footsteps, for secret meetings, for the scrape of weapons being drawn in alleys. Picture a watchman pausing at the corner of a piazza, his breath clouds in the cool air. He hears something, not a thief, not a drunk, but voices speaking low and quick. He edges closer, lantern lifted. The light reveals 3 men cloaked in shadow, their hands gesturing, faces tense. They see him fall silent, then slip away into the maze of streets. He does not follow, for to follow might mean death. Instead, he notes the house they entered, the guild symbol carved above the doorway. By morning, others will know. If you're still listening, you don't need to unravel their words. Let the image of whispers in the night pass like a dream half remembered. For ordinary people, conspiracies were distant, yet ever present, like thunder beyond the horizon. They went about their work, their prayers, their meals, but at night, when the watch passed by, they wondered who else might be moving in the dark and what new turn the city's politics might take before dawn. The bells of the watch every city in Europe had its bells, but in Florence they held particular power. The great bell of the Palazzo della Signoria, called the Vacca, was rung in times of danger, summoning citizens to arms. Other bells marked curfews, the closing of taverns, the beginning of night. The watch was guided by these sounds, their calls echoing after the bells. Hour by hour, you hear it now in your imagination, a bell's deep tone rolling across the city, reverberating against walls, fading into the night. Then, moments later, the watchman's cry, 4 of the clock, and all is well. But not all was well. Fires, thefts, and conspiracies never rested. And so, each cry of the watch was not a statement of truth, but a hope, a prayer spoken aloud into the dark. If you're still listening, notice how the sound fades. You don't have to hold on to the words. Just feel the echo dissolve into silence. Dawn over Florence slowly. Night yields to morning. The sky softens gray before it glows. Bakers open their shops, the smell of bread filling narrow lanes. The sound of hammers returns as workshops stir to life. The watch extinguishes their lanterns, handing staves back, shoulders sagging with weariness. Their voices are low now, relieved, as if dawn itself has carried away the dangers of the night. You see them walk past the river, where mist rises from the surface. You see the guild halls open, men entering for business, their eyes bright from sleep. The dangers of the night dissolve into the rhythm of day, but they never fully vanish. Each night will come again, with its shadows, its whispers, and its fragile line between safety and fear. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. You don't have to remember every name, every detail. It is enough to rest in the image of lanterns extinguished, of bells quieting, of Florence breathing in the first lighted day. And yet one question drifts, soft and unresolved. Did the watch protect the city from danger? Or did it only remind everyone that danger was always there? That danger was always there. You hear the muffled clang of a heavy bell rolling across a city of timber and stone. The sound bends through narrow alleys and spills over the river, its echoes mingling with the damp mist of the Thames. The year is long before fire would remake London, long before gas lamps softened its streets. Now, the city moves between silence and alarm, between the safety of sleep and the uncertain voices of the night watch. You feel the cold. It presses against your face as if the fog itself were alive, curling and shifting, folding around every doorway and bridge. A lantern swings, its flame fighting to stay alight in the wet air. And then a voice, not gentle, not melodic, but carrying weight, past 10 of the clock. And a fair night. The words feel steady, yet they are never quite true. For in London, nights were rarely fair. They carried the dangers of thieves, the fear of sudden fire, the shadow of disease, and the burden of secrets whispered in darkness. You don't need to hold every detail close. Just let it pass like fog sliding over the river's surface, breaking and reforming. The cry of the watch in medieval London. The cry of the watch was both reassurance and warning. Each hour, men tasked with guarding the city walked its lanes, their voices carrying the time into homes where shutters were barred. 11 of the clock, and all's well. The words carried further than any candlelight could reach. They were meant to comfort, to remind you that the city still breathed, that others remained awake when you could not. But those same cries also revealed the city's fragility. When the voice rang out, fire and candle, take care, you knew the risk was real. London was built of timber, roofs, thatched, beams, tarred, alleys so narrow that fire could leap across them like sparks jumping from a log. Picture the silence that followed such a cry. You hear it in your imagination. Shutters opening slightly as residents peer into the night, listening for the crackle of flame. You smell the faint smoke of hearts banked low, hoping they would not ignite. The watchman's voice drifts away, yet the unease lingers. If you're still listening, it's enough to let the sound roll past, like a memory half whispered. Watch dashed houses and curfew bells. London's watch was not scattered at random. Each ward of the city had its watchhouse, a small shelter where men gathered before patrol. They carried staves or bills, sometimes little more than clubs, and a horn to call others in alarm. You can imagine the scene. Inside the watchhouse, the air is thick with smoke from a small fire. Boots rest on the embers, drying from rain. The men speak in low tones, their words muffled by the damp walls. One yawns, another tightens his cloak, while the captain scratches a note into a ledger by candlelight dot. Then the curfew bell sounds, deep, resonant, slow. It announces not just the time, but the expectation. Shutters closed, taverns emptied, fire safely damped. By order, the streets should be clear. Yet, the watch knows better. For, as the bell fades, they step outside to find the night still restless. A drunk staggers from a tavern door, muttering. A horse clatters along cobbles, its rider cloaked and hooded. A woman carries water from a public fountain, her breath misting in the cold. Life does not end with the bell. It only slips deeper into shadow. If you're still listening, notice how the sound of the bell lingers. You don't need to follow every step of the watch. It's enough to feel the rhythm of the night moving slowly forward. Fire, the ever-present fear for Londoners. Fire was the great terror. Long before the famous blaze of 1666, smaller fires tore through streets and markets. A single spark from a candle could spread across thatched roofs, and so the night watch was tasked not only with guarding against thieves, but with listening for the first hint of flame. Picture it. A watchman pauses at the corner of Cheapside, lantern raised. The air is heavy, damp, quiet. Then he hears it, faint, like the crack of wood in a hearth, but sharper, urgent. He smells smoke, not the familiar comfort of hearth fire, but the acrid sting of something larger. He calls out, his voice cutting the night. Fire! Fire! Suddenly, the silence breaks. Bells ring out in alarm. Buckets are filled. Chains of men and women form, passing water hand to hand. The glow spreads against timber walls, orange against the mist. You see the watchman's face lit by firelight, determined, weary, desperate. If you're still listening, you don't have to picture every detail of the flames. Just imagine the light flickering across stone and water, then fading again into the darkness once more. Thieves in the lanes, but fire was not the only danger. The night carried men who knew how to move without sound. Thieves slipped along the lanes, cutting purses, lifting shutters, prying at doors. Some worked alone, shadows within shadows. Others moved in bands, armed and confident. The watch walked with lanterns, yet lanterns gave away their position as much as they revealed. A thief might hear the call of 2 of the clock and slip into a doorway, waiting, silent, until the light passed. When the watchman's back was turned, the thief moved again. Quick as a rat, imagine the sound. Footsteps on wet cobbles, too soft to be honest. The creak of wood as a door is forced. A muffled cry, then silence. The watch may pass by unaware, their lanterns swinging just out of reach. And so, the people of London locked their shutters tight, prayed against fire, and trusted that the watch would keep at least part of the darkness at bay. If you're still listening, you don't need to know whether the thief was caught. Let the sound of the footsteps dissolve into silence, leaving only the damp echo of water dripping from eaves. The plague and the silence, perhaps. The most haunting nights were those touched by plague. When pestilence spread through London, silence grew heavier than any fog. The watch still walked, but their voices seemed smaller, echoing against empty streets. They did not just guard against thieves, they also guarded doors. Homes marked with red crosses, where families were locked inside, left only with food delivered at night. Picture it, a watchman halts before such a door. The mark is fresh, the paint glistening faintly in the lantern's glow. From inside, no sound comes, only stillness. He places a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water at the threshold, then moves on. His staff taps against the stone, then fades. Behind him, the silence feels unbearable. If you're still listening, you don't need to imagine the sickness itself. Just the silence, heavy and unmoving, as if the entire city were holding its breath. Dawn over London, and then, as in Florence, dawn comes, slowly, faintly. A gray light spreads across the rooftops. The fog thins, revealing the outlines of steeples, bridges, and towers. The watch lowers their lanterns, weary after hours of walking. Their voices are softer now, the last cries of the night barely above whispers. The city stirs again. Bakers open their ovens, the smell of bread drifting through narrow lanes. Merchants lift shutters, coughing as they greet the morning air. Children run in alleys, their laughter sharp after the long silence. And the watch, having walked through whispers, fire, and shadow, return to their watch house. They hang up their staves, close their eyes, and rest till the next night calls them again. If you're still listening, notice how the night fades. You don't need to hold every detail of the cries, the fires, the thieves. It is enough to feel the rhythm of voices calling hours, fading into silence, replaced by the steady hum of morning life. And a question remains, soft and unresolved. Did the watch truly keep the city safe? Or did they simply remind everyone how fragile safety was? Asterisk, you hear it first, not in a great city, but in a smaller place. A town surrounded by fields, hedges, in the slow winding of a river. The sound is quieter, the rhythm of the night more fragile. The walls are lower than those of London or Florence. The streets narrower, the homes simpler, with timber beams and shutters that creak when the wind presses them. It is here that the night watch feels most intimate, most uncertain. A single voice, calling through darkness, is enough to be heard across nearly the entire settlement. Midnight, and all is well. The words drift across orchards, over thatched roofs, through empty lanes where frost lies on cobblestones. Chickens shift in their coops, dogs stir at the edges of fields, and sleepers, wrapped in blankets, hear the call faintly and sink deeper into rest. You don't need to remember every detail of the voice, only the feeling of it moving across the stillness, the intimacy of smallness in great cities. The night watch was one of many layers of defense. But in smaller towns, the men who walked the lanes were not strangers. They were neighbors. A miller one week, a carpenter the next, a brewer another. Everyone knew their voices, their steps, their habits. Imagine it. You lie in your bed, hearing the cry of the watch. You know who it is? Perhaps it is Thomas, the smith, whose heavy boots always strike unevenly. Or Richard, the cooper, whose voice cracks slightly when he calls the hour. Their presence comforts you because it is familiar. And yet, that familiarity also carried risk. A neighbor might be too lenient with friends, too blind to their own family's misdeeds. The watch in small towns was less about rigid authority and more about fragile trust. If you're still listening, let that word trust echo softly, then fade. You don't have to weigh it heavily. Just let it dissolve into the stillness, shadows and superstition for many in smaller towns. The night was not only dangerous for its thieves and fires, but for what lay beyond the reach of reason. Shadows stretched differently at night. The creak of branches sounded like whispers. The hoot of an owl was mistaken for a warning. And so, watchmen often carried more than staves and lanterns. They carried prayers, charms, or whispered verses meant to guard against spirits. Some believed that calling the hour aloud not only warned thieves, but also drove away wandering souls. Picture it. A man stands at the corner of a silent square. His lantern casts light on the ground, but above, the church spire looms, black against the sky. He shifts his staff, breathes deeply, and calls, 2 of the clock, and the spirits kept at bay. His voice trembles slightly, but once spoken, the words feel like protection. If you're still listening, you don't need to picture the spirits themselves, just the lantern, the breath, the trembling call that pushes the darkness back for a moment. Watch and superstition, intertwining superstition, gave the watch a second purpose, not only to keep humans safe, but to guard the very boundary between the seen and the unseen. In records from small towns, you sometimes find curious phrases. Watchmen who wrote that they heard voices in the air, or who swore they saw lights move in the churchyard, so no one was there. Perhaps it was only their tiredness. Perhaps it was the sway of lantern flame or the way fog moves in tendrils. But for those who lived then, these sights felt real. And they were added into the rhythm of the watch, the sound of boots on frost, the call of the hour, and the muttered prayer afterward, just in case. If you're still listening, you don't need to decide whether they were right or wrong. Just rest in the image of lantern light moving over frost, while breath clouds the air and silence folds around everything else. The fear of fire, still present even in small towns. Fire was feared. But here, the danger came not from great markets or crowded wards, but from the thatched roofs themselves. A single spark from a hearth could leap to a neighbor's roof within minutes. Picture a watchman pausing before a house where the chimney smokes too much. He smells the soot, sharp and heavy, sees sparks slip into the night air. He bangs on the door with his staff, waking the family. The father rushes out, embarrassed, pouring water on the fire, muttering apologies. The watchman nods, but his eyes linger on the roof until the smoke thins. Then, once again, the silence returns. If you're still listening, it's enough to let the smell of soot drift into your imagination and then fade, replaced by the cold freshness of frost-taught festivals and the watch there were nights. However, when silence was broken, not by danger, but by celebration, feasts, fairs, or holy days turned towns into places of light and noise, even deep into the night. The watch on such evenings was not a task of silence, but of crowd control. Imagine it, lanterns strung across streets, musicians playing, laughter spilling into the dark. The watch moved through the throng, their staffs less weapons than walking sticks. They reminded tavern keepers to close at curfew, coaxed drunks homeward, and ensured that no quarrel grew too sharp. And yet, even amid celebration, the watch never lost its edge of seriousness. For joy could turn quickly to fire or to fight. A lantern might fall, a fist might strike, and the stillness of dawn might come only after tension. If you're still listening, you don't have to hold the noise too tightly. Just imagine it fading, the laughter, the music, until only the sound of boots and lanterns remains, passing through gates in many small towns. Gates closed at night. The watch was responsible for them, locking and unlocking, keeping keys at their side. No one entered or left without their knowledge. Picture the creak of the wooden gate as it closes, iron bar sliding into place. The sound is final, heavy. A dog barks outside, then falls silent. Beyond the gate lies darkness, fields, and the unknown. Within, the lanterns of the watch circled the streets. And so, towns became islands of light and seas of darkness. The gate marked the boundary between safety and danger, between home and wilderness. If you're still listening, let that image soften. You don't have to remember every detail of the gate. It's only the weight of its closing sound, firm and steady. Dawn in the countryside town is in every place. Dawn came slowly. The watch gave their last calls, faint, almost whispers. 5 of the clock, and all is well. Then they extinguished their lanterns, handing keys back. Their breaths weary, the sky lightened, cockerels crowed, and smoke rose gently from chimneys. Farmers lead animals into fields. Children rubbed their eyes and stepped out into the cold. Their laughter brighter than the fading calls of the watch. And so, the night dissolved again, its fears and whispers fading with it, but the memory remained, the sound of voices in the dark, of boots on stone, of lantern light pushing shadows back. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to follow the hours precisely. It is enough to feel the rhythm of night passing into morning, and to wonder softly, were the watchmen guarding the town? Or was the town itself guarding them, giving them purpose through its silence? Asterisk, you hear it first, not in the silence of night, but in the quiet dryness of air that carries no moisture. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of the great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, where once water surged, restless and plentiful, but now, in certain seasons, it trickles, shallow, muddy, revealing cracked stones beneath. The wind brushes against your face, warm and unyielding, carrying dust that settles into every crease of clothing, every wrinkle of skin. The people of these lands lived in a cycle of dependence. Rain fell rarely. Instead, life relied on the rivers, whose floods once spread rich silt across fields, feeding wheat, barley, and dates. But the floods did not always arrive as expected. Some years, waters came too late or too small. The canals, dug painstakingly by human hands, carried only enough for the privileged fields near the city, while others lay bare, crops shriveling before they ripened. If you're still listening, you don't have to follow each name, each crop. It's enough to hear the faint sound of wind moving across open land, and to picture how silence deepens when water is missing. The first signs of struggling, a city like yours, you would hear the sound of chisels on stone tablets, scribes marking tallies of grain and water. These records were not written idly. They were attempts to track scarcity. A farmer might bring his complaint, his canal dry, his field barren. A priest might demand offerings, blaming neglect of gods. The city official would mark numbers into clay, silent, except for the sharp scratch of reed on wet surface. Step outside the temple, and you would hear the contrast. The earth beneath your feet is dusty, cracks open like veins across the soil. The air is heavy, but with nothing nourishing in it. No scent of rain, no promise of relief. Goats bleat weakly, their ribs visible. that keeps pulling them by cords in search of greener ground. And in the streets, whispers rise. Was it the gods' anger? Was it neglect of ritual? Or was it simply the way the earth turned, indifferent to human need? If you're still listening, you don't have to resolve those whispers. Just let them drift, unanswered. Like dust carried away by wind. Canals as lifelines. The canals of Mesopotamia were more than ditches of water. They were veins of survival, carved through clay, lined with reeds, carrying the gift of rivers into fields that stretched far beyond. But canals required endless work. Silt had to be dug out. Walls had to be shored up. Without maintenance, water escaped, soaking useless ground or evaporating into the dry air. Imagine the sound. Men with baskets scooping mud. The splash of water as it is redirected. The groan of oxen pulling sledges filled with wet earth. The sun beats down, relentless. Their sweat mixes with dust, leaving streaks on their skin. And still, the water trickles only so far. When drought lingered, canals turned shallow, green with stagnant scum. Fish died, insects bred, the air filled with a sweet, rotting smell that clung to everything. And in the silence of night, farmers looked toward the city, wondering if the priests and rulers could command the gods, or if the gods themselves had turned their faces away. You don't have to picture every canal. Just imagine one line of water, narrowing, shrinking, till it is little more than a thread across the landscape. Famine creeping in when crops failed. Famine crept quietly, not in sudden catastrophe, but in slow erosion. First, grain prices rose in markets. The cries of sellers grew sharper, louder, echoing off clay walls. Then, loaves grew smaller, stews thinner. Families mixed barley husks with ground reeds, stretching what they had. Picture a woman kneeling at a grinding stone. The sound is steady, stone against stone, but the meal she produces is rough, bitter, filled with grit. Children eat it anyway, chewing slowly, their stomachs aching for more. Outside, the marketplace buzzes with arguments. Who will pay? Who will go without? And then silence. A stall stands empty. A field lies fallow. A house has its door barred, no smoke rising from its hearth. Famine takes not only bodies, but the sound of life itself. If you're still listening, you don't need to remember who starved first, who bargained most. It is enough to rest in the image of empty stalls, empty fields, and silence where voices once crowded together. Gods and the climate together. Gods and the climate. To those who lived in Mesopotamia, drought was not seen as weather alone. It was divine judgment. If water failed, it was because the gods were displeased. Rituals intensified. Priests poured wine, burned incense, slaughtered lambs. The air filled with the sharp smell of blood and smoke, drifting above ziggurats into the pale sky. Imagine standing in a temple courtyard. You hear chanting, rhythmic, deep, echoing against baked brick. The people bow, their faces pressed to the ground. The heat is overwhelming, the smell of incense thick, almost choking. A priest lifts his arms, calling to the heavens, his voice raw, demanding rain. But when the chant ends, the sky remains empty, pale, cloudless. The people rise slowly, dust clinging to their foreheads. Their eyes filled with questions. They dare not speak. If you're still listening, you don't need to judge whether their gods answered. Just let the image of smoke against an empty sky drift like a dream you won't try to hold. To move toward cities strangely, drought often pushed people closer to cities, not away. Villages abandoned their parched fields, and families crowded into walls that offered at least the hope of grain stored, canals repaired, gods appeased. But this made the struggle worse. Too many mouths, too little food. Disease spread where water stagnated. Picture narrow streets crowded with weary faces. Children cling to mothers, their eyes hollow. Water sellers call out, carrying jars that slosh faintly. their prices climbing higher with each day of sun. Animals, thin and restless, stumble through lanes meant for people, their smell sharp in the heat, and over it all, the voice of a herald, shouting decrees from a ruler. Rationing of grain, punishment for hoarding, promises of divine favor if obedience is kept. His words echo, but their weight feels thin, fragile, like reeds bent in the wind. If you're still listening, you don't need to hear every decree. Let them fade, leaving only the image of a crowd pressed close, restless, uncertain. Collapse whispered in silence. Over time, many Mesopotamian cities shrank. Some vanished. Droughts, repeated again and again, undermined not just harvests, but faith. Canals dried. Fields turned to salt-crusted plains. Walls crumbled when no one remained to mend them. Imagine walking through such a place. The sound of your footsteps on cracked clay. The silence of homes roofless, their bricks falling into dust. The wind moves through empty doorways, whistling faintly, as if mocking the voices once loud within. A broken tablet lies half buried, its marks eroded. You pick it up, feel its weight, but its meaning is lost. If you're still listening, you don't have to hold the image tightly. Just let it settle, like dust on stone, forgotten, inevitable. Reflection at dawn as dawn rises over the ruins. The sky glows pale, the air still dry. You smell dust, sharp and empty. A bird calls faintly, its wings cutting across the silence. The city does not stir, for it no longer breathes. Only memory lingers, and you wonder, softly, whether the climate destroyed the city, or whether it was the people's faith and control that collapsed first. If you're still listening, notice how slow the rhythm has become. You don't need to carry all the names, all the temples, all the rivers. It is enough to rest in the image of silence folding around ruins, and to drift with the thought, did the rivers betray the people, or did the people ask too much of the rivers? Asterisk, you hear the faint scrape of sandals on rocky ground, a sound softened by dust. The sun is low, yet its heat lingers, heavy, pressing against the skin. All around, hills rise, bare and stony, with only a scattering of olive trees clinging to the slopes. The air smells faintly of dry earth, cracked and thirsty, mixed with the faint bitterness of time carried by the wind. This is not the Greece of marble temples and poetry, not yet. This is an earlier Greece, where survival meant coaxing life out of soil that was already thin, already weary, and the struggle against climate shaped not just the crops they planted, but the very stories they told. You don't need to hold every detail in your mind. Just let the sound of sandals fade into silence, and picture the land itself, stubborn, ancient, watching quietly as people tried to bend it toward their will. Thin soil and fragile landing like the broad, fertile plains of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Much of Greece was rocky and uneven. Valleys were small, hemmed in by mountains. Rain fell irregularly, heavy in bursts, then gone for long stretches. When it came, it sometimes swept soil away instead of nourishing it, leaving stones glistening in the sun. Imagine a farmer bent low, his hands working at soil that crumbles, too shallow for deep roots. He plants barley, hardy enough to endure, but he knows the yield will be small. The sound of his hoe strikes against rock again and again. More stone than earth. Sweat drips into dust, vanishing instantly. And yet, amid this hardness, certain crops endured. Olives, grapes, barley. They grew not from abundance, but from stubbornness. And in their survival, they shaped the Greek diet economy and imagination. If you're still listening, let the image of shallow soil linger. You don't need to measure yields or remember dates. Just hear the quiet scrape of hoe on stone, the silence that follows. Deforestation and its echoes. The Greeks cut forests to build ships, to clear land, to fuel fires for cooking and metalwork. At first, the trees seemed endless. Pines, oaks, and cypresses stretched across hillsides, shading springs and streams. But as centuries passed, the forest thinned, hills grew bare, springs dried, without roots to hold soil. Rains washed it away, leaving the land harsher than before. Picture the sound of axes on wood, sharp, echoing in valleys, the crash of a tree falling, leaves rustling as branches strike earth. Then, silence, a silence different from before, emptier, more fragile. Where once birds called, now only wind moves over bare ground. The people noticed. They told stories of gods offended, of nymphs fleeing groves, of spirits abandoning springs. Myths became warnings. Cut too much, and divine anger would follow. But the practical truth was just as heavy. Fewer trees meant less water, thinner soil, harsher summers. If you're still listening, let the sound of the axe fade, replaced by the emptiness of a hillside stripped bare. You don't need to remember every tree, just the silence that follows when forests are gone. Myths born of climate Greek mythology is filled with stories of drought and famine. Think of Demeter, goddess of grain, whose grief at the loss of her daughter Persephone brought winter to the earth, or of kings punished with land that yielded nothing, their people starving as divine consequence. But perhaps these myths were more than allegory. Perhaps they carried memory of years when rains failed, when harvests shrank, when people prayed desperately for relief. Imagine a small shrine in a valley. Farmers gather, their faces lined with dust and weariness. They bring offerings, a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, a cluster of olives. Smoke rises, faint and bitter, curling into dry air. Their voices chant slowly, begging for rain, their words echoing against rocky hills. The air does not change. The sky stays pale, cloudless, yet the act itself soothes them, gives them a sense of order against the chaos of climate. If you're still listening, you don't need to decide whether the gods answered. Just hear the chant drift into silence, unanswered but enduring. Cities shaped by scarcity did not only shape myth, it shaped politics. Cities like Athens and Corinth learned to look outward, trading across the sea when their land could no longer sustain them. Colonies were founded not just for ambition, but for survival, to find fields less rocky, soils less weary. Picture the harbor of Corinth at dawn. Ships creak against wooden piers, sails furled, hulls heavy with amphory. The smell of salt and pitch fills the air. Men call out, their voices mingling with gulls overhead. These ships will carry wine and oil outward and return with grain from Egypt, Sicily, or the black seafood their own hills could not provide. The sea became a second field, a place to harvest what their land could not. And so, Greek culture was carried across waters, not because of wealth alone, but because of necessity. If you're still listening, let the image of creaking ships drift by. You don't need to follow every colony or every trade route. Just imagine the sound of water against wood, steady, endless, like breath. War over resources, scarcity, also meant tension. When land is poor, every valley, every spring, every grove matters. Cities fought not just for honor, but for fertile ground, for water, for timber. And so the harshness of the land fed the harshness of politics. Picture a narrow valley, its fields green against the rocky hills. Two armies face each other, their shields gleaming, their spears like a forest of bronze. The air is dry, filled with the smell of sweat and dust. They are not only fighting for power, they are fighting for survival, for the right to feed their people. The clash comes, sudden and sharp, bronze against bronze, shouts echoing across stone, and then silence, the valley returning to stillness once more, but with fewer voices to fill it. If you're still listening, you don't need to hold the details of each battle. Just imagine the silence that follows, heavier than before, as the valley waits for rain that may or may not come. The resilience of adaptation, and yet, despite the dryness, despite the struggle, the Greeks endured. They learned to terrace hillsides, to trap thin soil and keep it from washing away. They dug cisterns, storing precious rain. They cultivated olives, vines, and hardy grains, foods that did not demand abundance, but gave generously from little. Imagine standing on a hillside dotted with olive trees. The air is dry, but the silver leaves shimmer in sunlight, their roots deep, stubborn. Grapevines wind along terraces, their twisted branches holding fruit that thrives even in poor soil. The scent of crushed olives and pressed grapes drifts from small stone presses, mingling with the warm wind out here. Life continues, not through plenty, but through resilience. The land offers little, but the people learn to accept and adapt. If you're still listening, let that word resilience linger softly. You don't have to hold its weight. Just let it settle like dust on stone, quiet and enduring. Reflection beneath the sky as night falls. Stars emerge, brilliant against the darkness. The air cools, carrying the faint scent of herbs from hillsides. The town's quiet, their people gathered in small homes, eating simple meals, bread, olives, wine. They speak of gods, of heroes, of struggles, weaving myths that will outlast their own hardships. You hear a storyteller by firelight, his voice calm, steady, carrying tales of Persephone, of drought and return, of the fragile line between abundance and hunger. Children listen, their eyes wide, their stomachs not entirely full. The fire crackles, sparks rising into the dry night. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. You don't need to carry every myth, every harvest. It is enough to feel the rhythm of voices fading into the night, and to wonder softly, did the Greeks tell these stories to explain the land? Or did the land itself shape the stories, whispering them through drought and dust? Asterisk, you hear it first in the sound of water, the steady rush of the Tiber, carrying its muddy current past stone embankments, beneath arches of bridges crowded with carts and people. The river seems eternal, yet it has moods. Some days it flows calm, its surface golden in sunlight, carrying barges heavy with grain. Other days it swells suddenly, overflowing banks, flooding homes, carrying timber, animals, even bodies through streets not built to endure its rage. Imagine standing at dawn by the river. The air is cool, smelling of damp earth and smoke from distant hearts. Fog rises faintly, softening the outlines of aqueducts and arches. And in that moment, you understand why the river was both a gift and threat, a source of survival, yet a reminder of nature's power beyond control. If you're still listening, you don't need to recall every detail of the river's course. Just let the sound of water flow in your imagination, steady, timeless. It's carrying the weight of history. The reliance on grain roam was vast, its appetite endless. 1,000,000 mouths demanded bread, and the land around the city could not provide enough. Grain came from afar, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily. Ships brought it across seas, docking at Astia, carried apriver to feed the masses. But climate touched even this grand system. When Nile floods failed, Egypt's harvest shrank. Grain prices rose. Riots spread in Rome, voices shouting through the forum, demanding bread. The emperor's image depended not just on armies or monuments, but on whether bellies were filled. Picture the marketplace, noisy, chaotic. Merchants shout, amphorae clatter. The smell of baked bread drifts warm and sharp. Then the grain stalls stand empty. The noise changes. Shouts become anger. Fists raised. Soldiers called in. Hunger makes a city restless. If you're still listening, you don't have to track each famine or each emperor's response. It's enough to feel the way hunger unsettles silence, placing calm with echoing cries. Floods and the Tiber wild droughts struck elsewhere. Rome itself often faced too much water. The Tiber swelled, overflowing into lower quarters. Homes flooded, streets turned to rivers, bridges weakened. Each flood carried silt, filling basements, rotting timber, leaving behind a damp smell that lingered for weeks. Imagine wading through a flooded street, The water is brown, cold, rising against stone walls. A barrel floats past, then a dead pig, then a broken chair. People call out from upper windows, their voices sharp, urgent. The air is filled with the stench of sewage, for drains overflow, mixing filth with floodwater. And yet, when the waters receded, life resumed. People shoveled mud, repaired doors, lit fires to dry walls. Floods were reminders the city was strong, but nature always returned, pressing against its edges. If you're still listening, let the image of receding water drift by. You don't need to remember each flood, only the rhythm. Too much, then too little. Always beyond control. The hunger for woodrum devoured wood. Timber-built houses, fueled fires, powered baths, forged weapons. Forests across Italy thinned, then vanished. Hills once shaded with oaks and pines became bare, their soil sliding away in rains. Springs dried where roots once held them. Picture the sound of axes in a forest, sharp, rhythmic, echoing. Then the crack of a trunk, the thunder of a tree falling, leaves rustling. Silence follows, broken only by wind moving across a clearing that grows larger with each cut. Birds vanish. Springs shrink. The forest becomes memory to feed its baths and kitchens. Rome turned to distant lands. Ships carried timber from Gaul, from the Balkans, from North Africa. The appetite never ceased. And yet, each log carried meant another hillside left naked, another stream silenced. If you're still listening, let the sound of the falling tree echo once, then fade. You don't need to track every shipment, just the emptiness left behind. Air heavy with smoke. Imagine standing in Rome at dusk. Fires burn everywhere, in homes, in bakeries, in forges, in baths. The air is thick, acrid, filled with wood smoke. It stings eyes, coats, skin. Voices echo in the haze, muffled, as if the city were wrapped in a smoky veil. The smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of sewage, of animals, of sweat. At times, winds carried it away. At others, it lingered, pressing into lungs, making breathing itself an effort. Some ancient writers noted the heaviness of Rome's air, the way sickness seemed to spread more easily. Was it only crowding? Or was it also the city's appetite for burning, filling skies with smoke until the air itself seemed weary? If you're still listening, you don't need to answer. Just imagine the haze, drifting, softening outlines of temples and arches, dissolving stone into shadow. Drought beyond the city even, as Rome burned wood and flooded streets. Drought struck in provinces that fed it. In North Africa, fields of wheat stretched wide, yet without rain, they shriveled. In Sicily, dry winds carried soil away. Colonies once rich became fragile, their abundance conditional on skies that did not always cooperate. Picture a farmer walking through a parched field. The earth cracks beneath his sandals, each step releasing dust. His grain has not grown tall. It lies thin, brittle, already turning yellow. He lifts a stalk, crushes it in his hand, and it crumbles. Around him, silence stretches, broken only by the call of a crow. Back in Rome, grain shipments slow. The Tiber's docks grow restless. Whispers spread. Will the emperor provide, or will hunger gnaw again? If you're still listening, let the image of dust in the farmer's hands dissolve. You don't need to track which year, which harvest. It is enough to feel how distance does not matter when hunger travels with ships. The whispers of collapse, centuries past. The climate shifted subtly. Some years colder, some hotter, rains less steady. To the Romans, it may not have seemed catastrophic, only harder. Yet over time, harder becomes fragile. Crops thin, armies stretched, forests gone. And when invasions came, when politics fractured, the land itself no longer gave as before. Imagine walking through a villa abandoned, its courtyard cracked, fountains dry, vines overgrowing walls. The silence is thick, broken only by the creak of shutters and wind. Once, it thrived servants' footsteps, water trickling, voices calling across marble halls. Now, only echoes remain. If you're still listening, notice how the silence deepens. You don't need to weigh every cause of Rome's decline. Just feel how emptiness lingers when abundance fades. Reflection beneath fading light as the sun sets over the ruins of Rome. The air cools, carrying scents of dust and distant smoke. The Tiber flows still, indifferent, its surface golden in evening light. Children play among broken columns, their laughter brief, then gone. The city remains, but changed, smaller, quieter, more fragile, and you wonder, softly, whether climate shaped its fall as much as politics, whether rivers and forests withdrew their gifts as silently as armies withdrew their loyalty. If you're still listening, let time feel slower now. You don't have to hold every detail. It is enough to picture the river flowing past a stone, eternal, while the city around it shifts and crumbles, and to drift into the question, did Rome fall from enemies outside, or from the slow silence of land and sky withdrawing their favor? Of land and sky withdrawing their favor. You hear it before you see it. The creak of timber, the groan of planks shifting against iron nails, the faint slap of waves against a narrow hall. The sound is steady, rhythmic, like breathing, and then, through drifting fog, the outline of a long ship emerges, low, slender, carved with the head of a beast to frighten enemies and protect those within. Its sail is furled for now, ropes sagging damp with mist. Oars extend out, moving in unison, dipping and rising with quiet discipline. The air is salt-heavy, sharp in your nostrils. Sea spray cools your skin, and you notice how the world feels, both wide and claustrophobic. The endless sea pressing against a vessel no larger than a village hall, filled with men who have left behind farms, hearths, and families. You don't need to follow every detail of the voyage. Just let the sound of the sea wash over you, each wave carrying the memory of centuries, the lure of the West for the Vikings. The sea was not a barrier, but a road, a shifting path of opportunity. Their sagas tell of lands to the west, first Shetland and Orkney, then Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, a place of wild grapes and forests where no one expected them. But why sail west into unknown fog? Some journeys were born of necessity. Population in Norway pressed against narrow strips of farmland. Younger sons had no inheritance. Others sought wealth, not always through raids, but through trade, new settlements, and fields unplowed. The sea whispered possibilities. Islands with grass for sheep, coasts where timber grew tall, shores where rivers poured silver fish. Imagine sitting at a Viking hearth before departure. The fire snaps, smoke curling into rafters, darkened with soot. A chieftain speaks of voyages others have taken, of lands across the horizon, of farms waiting, of riches in furs. Around him, silence grows heavy. Men listen, eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and hunger. The sea offers both promise and peril. And so, at dawn, they launch. The construction of a ship-pay longship was more than wood and iron. It was a piece of landscape reshaped into survival. Oak trees were felled in winter when sap ran low, split and shaped with axes. Each curve of timber matched the natural bend of grain. Iron rivets, forged in smoky forges, bound planks tight. The hull was clinker-built, overlapping like scales, flexible, yet strong. Riding waves rather than fighting them. Picture the sound of a forge as sparks fly, hammers strike, bellows breathe air into fire. Outside, men shape wood, the ring of axes echoing across snowy fields. Horses drag logs, leaving furrows in frost. The scent of resin, pine, and fresh split oak fills the air. Piece by piece, the skeleton of a ship rises until what was once forest stands reborn as vessel. By spring, the ship is ready. Women bring offerings, sprinkling ale or blood, whispering words for safe passage. The keel, like a backbone, carries both the weight of cargo and the weight of prayers. If you're still listening, notice how the craft feels alive, how each plank still remembers the tree it once was. You don't need to recall the details of construction. Just imagine the creak of wood as it touches water for the first time. Setting out into the North Atlantic is no calm sea. It shifts moods without warning. One moment calm stretches, the water flat, the horizon clear. The next, fog rolls thick, wind sharpens, and waves rear like mountains. For Viking sailors, navigation meant reading sky, stars, birds, and currents. A shard of sun glimpsed through mist, the flight of a seabird. The drift of seaweed, each offered direction. Imagine standing on deck. The wind bites, carrying salt. Your fingers are stiff, gripping an oar. Around you, only gray, sea, and sky blending. Horizon, invisible. Somewhere ahead lies land, but it may be days away, or weeks, or never. Each man rose, not only for himself, but for all aboard. They feared not only storms, but monsters said to lurk in northern seas, whales mistaken for islands, serpents that wrapped ships, mists that led men astray. Superstition mixed with skill, for when your world rests on water, belief fills the gaps where knowledge fades. If you're still listening, you don't have to decide which beliefs were true. Just feel the fog closing in, the sea breathing beneath you, endless, heavy, indifferent. The first islands, stepping stones west. The journey west was not a single leap, but a chain of stepping stones, from Norway to Shetland, Orkney, and the Faroes, each landfall marked by cliffs rising suddenly from sea. Green pastures above, seabirds wheeling. Farmers built turf houses. Sheep grazed on wet grass, and from there, sailors pushed further to Iceland, then Greenland, and beyond. Picture the moment of first landfall. A cry from the prow land, eyes strained through mist. Slowly, dark cliffs sharpen. The air shifts. You smell earth, wet moss, the faint sweetness of grass. After days of salt and water, it feels overwhelming. Feet touch ground, knees buckle slightly. Men fall silent, some crossing themselves, others whispering to old gods. But islands were not only refuge, they were staging points. From the Faroes, Iceland was another step. From Iceland, Greenland. From Greenland, lands farther still. Each time the sea opened wider, the leap grew longer, the risk greater. If you're still listening, you don't need to trace each step. It's enough to sense the rhythm of moving westland, sealand again, like the beating of waves themselves. Iceland, fire and frost in the 9th century. Iceland drew settlers with promises of land. Valleys lay open, grass for livestock, rivers for fishing. Yet the climate was harsh, winters long, volcanoes rumbling, ash covering fields, rivers freezing solid. Imagine a turf house in winter, its walls thick with sod, its roof buried in snow. Inside, a single fire smolders. The air smells of smoke, wool, dried fish. People huddle close, wrapped in cloaks, breath rising in faint mist. Outside, the wind howls, rattling doors, whistling across frozen plains. Inside, sagas are spoken, tales of gods and journeys. Words echoing in low rooms. Life in Iceland was survival, balanced on edge. Summer meant frantic work, cutting grass for hay, drying fish, gathering driftwood from distant shores. Winter meant waiting, enduring, praying the stores would last, and all the while, ships prepared, for beyond Iceland lay Greenland, harsher still. If you're still listening, let the sound of the wind against the turf walls lull you. You don't need to recall which chieftain ruled or which year they sailed. It's enough to picture the flicker of firelight against frozen silence. Greenland, the edge of the world. By the late 10th century, Greenland was settled. Its name was a lure chosen by Eric the Red, who hoped settlers would follow. Some did. They found fjords carved by ice, valleys where grass grew in brief summers. Sheep and cattle were kept, though winters were cruel. Imagine the sound of ice cracking on a fjord. The water shifts, groans, splits. Icebergs drift pale blue against darker seas. The air is sharp, biting lungs. Farms cling to narrow valleys, their turf houses pressed low against wind. Beyond them, endless stone and ice. Life here was fragile. One storm could scatter ships. One failed harvest could mean hunger. And yet, they endured, trading walrus ivory, furs, and hides with Europe. The settlements lasted centuries, though in time, the climate cooled further. Seas froze longer, contact thinned. If you're still listening, notice how the silence of ice feels heavier than fog. You don't need to imagine every detail of survival. Just feel how life pressed against the edge of possibility. Fragile as a flame in wind, toward Vinland beyond Greenland lay Vinland. Sagas tell of it, forests of timber, vines with grapes, rich hunting. Perhaps Newfoundland, perhaps farther south. Men sailed there, built small settlements, stayed seasons, then returned. The journeys were not steady colonization, fleeting touches, attempts at reaching something just out of grasp. Picture the moment of arrival. The shore lined with tall trees, unfamiliar birds calling, the air warmer, softer than Greenland's harshness. Men step onto sand, kneel, press hands into earth. Fires are lit, shelters built. For a moment, it feels like a new beginning, but the land was not empty. Indigenous peoples lived there already, their presence recorded in the sagas as both trade and conflict. The Norse called them skryling, and though encounters were brief, they remind us these voyages were never into empty worlds, but into landscapes already alive with human presence. If you're still listening, let the sound of waves on a new shore drift through you. You don't need to resolve which bay was Vinland. It's enough to imagine the feeling of stepping into a place both promising and unknown. Re-anchor if you're still listening. Notice how time feels slower now. The sound of waves, the creak of ships, the hush of fog, it all blends into a rhythm. You don't need to follow each place or each name. Just drift with the thought of people sailing into mist, guided by stars, by birds, by belief. Reflection. The Viking journeys across the Atlantic were not only about discovery. They were about endurance, about pushing against sea and sky, about testing the limits of what small ships could carry. They left traces, sagas written centuries later, ruins in Greenland, artifacts in Newfoundland. But much remains uncertain, wrapped in fog, like the sea itself, and you wonder, softly, whether they sailed west for land, or for something less tangible, for hope, for freedom, for the quiet certainty that beyond the horizon, something waited. If you're still listening, let the question linger like fog on the sea. What truly drew them into the mist? Necessity, greed, or the endless human pull toward horizons unseen? Endless human pull toward horizons unseen. You hear it, not on the deck of a ship this time, but within the hush of a hall. The wind moans outside, rattling turf walls, while inside, the fire glows low and red. Sparks drift upward, swallowed by the smoky rafters. Men and women sit close, cloaks drawn, children curled against their mothers. The day's labor is over. Meat simmers in a pot, the smell of fat mingling with smoke. And then, as silence deepens, a voice begins. It is the voice of memory, of sagas, the world of spoken history for the Norse. Writing was rare. Their world was carried in words spoken aloud, repeated across generations. Sagas were more than entertainment. They were memory, history, law, and identity. By firelight, journeys across the Atlantic took shape again. Not as dry records, but as living stories. You hear the rise and fall of the skald's voice, measured, steady, like oars dipping in water. Each name, each place, each deed becomes vivid through sound. And you notice how the listeners lean forward, eyes glinting in the glow. For them, these stories are not distant, They are kinship. They are inheritance. You don't need to follow every name. The voice seems to reassure you. It's enough just to drift with the rhythm, to let the words roll like waves. The saga of the Greenlanders, one story told of Eric the Red, fierce and proud, banished from Iceland for killings, who sailed west and found Greenland. He gave it a hopeful name to lure others, and many came. But another story told of his children, Leif Erikson, tales of lands even farther, who set out with a crew and came upon Vinland. They found wild grapes, enough to give the place its name. They built shelters, stayed through a winter, and wondered if this was the edge of the known world. The hall grows still as the saga speaks of storms and strange encounters. Men row against wind, sails torn. Yet they press on. At last, land rises, soft hills, forests thick, rivers flowing. The listeners can almost taste the grapes, though many have never seen one. And then the saga speaks of meeting the Skrylings, trading first, then fighting. Arrows whistled, axes swung, fear rose. Though the land was rich, it was not theirs to take easily. If you're still listening, you don't have to decide what was true. Just picture the murmur of voices in the hall, the glow of embers, the way each word drifts like smoke, lingering long after it's spoken. The saga of Eric the Red, another version, tells the story differently. It lingers more on Gudrun, a woman of rare strength, who crossed oceans, bore children, and even journeyed to Rome. Her tale reminds the listeners that these voyages were not only for warriors, but for families, for women who carried life across seas as fragile as fire in the wind. Imagine Gudrun standing on the shore, cloak pressed by wind, watching ships prepare. Around her, cataloe, children cling, waves rise. She steps aboard, not knowing if she will ever return. And yet, she goes. Her footsteps carry her farther than any woman of her age, from Iceland to Greenland to Vinland, and back again by firelight. Her name is spoken with reverence for those who listen. It is not only a story of discovery, but of endurance, of faith that life continues even in the harshest places. If you're still listening, let Gudrun's presence linger, like a figure seen across fog, half real, half imagined, but wholly unforgettable. Memories shaped by silent sagas were not precise maps. They mixed memory with myth, detail with imagination. One man's voyage might be another's rumor, yet in their very uncertainty lies something soothing. The sea is not fixed. Neither are the stories. They ripple, bend, flow like water itself. And you notice how the silence in the hall between words is as important as the words themselves. Each pause lets listeners breathe, lets them picture the sea, the cliffs, the longship. The fire pops, a child stirs, the wind howls, and then the tale continues. You don't need to grasp each version. Just let the layers of memory drift past, voices upon voices, centuries upon centuries, like waves breaking on the same shore. Belief and wonder for the Norse. The world was not empty, but filled with forces, both seen and unseen. Gods watched, spirits lingered, omens appeared in sky and sea. When men sailed west, they did not sail alone. They carried Thor's hammer as charm, Odin's wisdom as guide, Freya's blessing for fertility of land. Imagine a sailor gazing at the night sky, stars scattered bright, northern lights shimmering green and red. He feels the presence of gods above, guiding or warning. He whispers words into the wind, hoping they reach ears unseen. When tales of Vinland spread, they were not only tales of geography, they were also tales of fate, of how gods shaped paths. To some, the grapes of Vinland seemed like gifts. To others, the conflicts with Skrylings seemed like signs that not all lands were meant to be theirs. If you're still listening, let that mixture of belief and doubt drift through you. You don't have to choose what they believed. It's enough to imagine how the sky above them seemed alive, how the sea itself seemed to breathe with unseen will. Fires fading, the saga ends slowly, as all stories do. The skull's voice lowers, words lengthen, pauses deepen. The hall is quiet. The fire burns lower, logs collapsing into red embers. Outside, snow falls softly, muffling sound. Inside, the listeners settle, some whispering prayers, others silent with thought. The story has ended, but its shape lingers. A child will repeat it tomorrow. A man will recall it on the sea. A woman will remember it as she spins wool. Stories move like rivers, feeding the memory of a people who crossed into fog. If you're still listening, notice how the hall grows darker, how the fire dims. You don't have to remember which saga was which. Just drift with the sense that words themselves are a kind of sea, carrying you gently, endlessly. Re-anchor if you're still listening. Notice how time feels slower now. The fire, the voices, the hush. It all folds together, like waves merging with fog. You don't need to recall the details. Just let them pass, like water slipping between your fingers. Reflection: the Viking journeys west are not only in the sagas of Greenlanders or of Eric the Red. They are also in the silences between words, in the unrecorded lives of those who endured, who sailed, who stayed, who vanished. And you wonder, softly, whether memory itself is a kind of voyage across darkness, across silence, always toward a horizon we glimpse but never fully reach. If you're still listening, let the question drift, open and unresolved. Were the voyages greater in reality or greater in memory, carried forever by voices in the glow of firelight? Asterisk. You hear the sound of wind again, but this time it is colder, sharper, almost hollow. It rattles through timbers left untended, presses against doors that no longer open, and sighs through rafters where no fire smolders. What was once a hall of voices is now an echoing shell. The sagas told of journeys, of triumphs, of discovery. Yet in time, those voices grew faint as the embers in a hearth when the last log is ash. Greenland, fading. Imagine Greenland in its height. Longhouses standing in clustered settlements, cattle lowing in their stalls, smoke rising in steady trails from turf-roofed homes. The sea at the edge of the fjord is alive with seals, the cliffs with birds, the waters with fish. For a time, life holds, but slowly the air cools. Winters deepen, summers shorten, harvests shrink. Ice presses harder against the coastlines. The Norse of Greenland had carried with them memories of pastures and meadows, of grazing cattle and tilled fields. Yet the land resisted. The soil was thin, the growing season brief. You hear the scraping of a wooden plow against stubborn earth, the grunt of oxen, the muttered prayers of farmers. Each year, the effort is greater, and each yield is smaller, and so hunger presses close. You don't need to count the seasons. Just feel the weight of the cold, the stillness of the land when food grows scarce, and the silence when a barn stands empty. The limits of distance. The settlements on Greenland were not isolated at first. Ships still came from Iceland and Norway, bringing iron, wood, cloth, and tools. In return, the Greenlanders offered walrus, ivory, hides, and furs. For a time, trade kept them alive, but distance was heavy. Storms cut roots, ships were lost, voyages delayed. Imagine standing on a cliff, gazing out at the horizon, waiting for sails that never appear. Days pass, weeks, a season, and finally, years. Without steady supply, iron tools, dull nails, rust, ropes fray. The people patch, mend, reuse. But each year, their world grows thinner. If you're still listening, let that distance settle in you, not just miles of ocean, but the kind of distance where silence itself grows, where the world beyond seems to drift farther away with each passing winter. Vinland, abandoned across the sea. Vinland was even more fragile. The sagas told of grapes and timber, but the truth was harsher. Encounters with the Skrylings were not fleeting. They were reminders that these lands were not empty, not waiting, not theirs to claim. One story tells of a sudden attack, arrows raining, warriors shouting, panic rising. Another tells of uneasy trades that soured into fear. Whatever the truth, the Norse soon realized they could not hold Vinland. Imagine dismantling a rough shelter, pulling logs from walls, loading what little can be carried back aboard a ship. Behind them, forests rustle with unseen eyes. Ahead, the sea stretches vast, uncertain. They leave not in triumph, but in retreat. And so Vinland drifts into memory. More dream than dwelling, more legend than home. If you're still listening, notice how the name itself, Vinland, lingers like a sigh, sweet with promise, but empty now, like the echo of a story fading into silence. Echo of a story fading into silence. Signs of decline by the 1300s. Greenland's settlements were shrinking. The western settlement disappeared first, its houses collapsing, its churches falling quiet. The eastern settlement endured longer, but even there, graves grew more numerous, houses fewer. Archaeologists today find bones of cattle slaughtered too young, of sheep and goats eaten in desperation. They find signs of malnutrition, of people too weak to endure. You don't need to imagine each excavation. Just picture the silence of an abandoned church. Stone walls still standing, but no voices rising in prayer. The altar is bare, the bench is empty, the wind blowing through cracks. It feels as if life had been there just yesterday, and yet centuries have passed. The Little Ice Age climate pressed harder. The period known as the Little Ice Age set in, chilling the North Atlantic. Seas iced over longer, making voyages rarer, cutting Greenland further from the world. You hear the crack of ice forming on the edge of a fjord, the groan of a frozen sea, the muffled stillness of snow that does not melt. Ships cannot break through. Travelers cannot arrive. The settlements become small islands within islands, enclosed not just by water, but by silence. If you're still listening, notice how the air in your imagination thickens with frost, how each breath feels like mist, how the silence folds closer when even the sea itself seems to sleep. Memory preserved in ruin. Peasants sailed centuries later. They found ruins. Turf walls crumbled, churches hollow, fields empty. The people of Greenland had vanished. No saga recorded their final days. No words told of their last winter. Were they starved? Were they taken by sickness? Did some sail back and vanish at sea? Did they merge with Inuit neighbors, their bloodlines absorbed into other lives? The silence does not answer, and you, listening now, don't need the answer. It is enough to sit with the quiet, to picture stone foundations against snow, to feel how memory itself grows cold and still. The weight of forgetting back in Iceland and Norway. The sagas continue to be told, but even they shifted. Journeys to Vinland became stories of the past. Greenland itself became distant, less visited, less remembered. By the time the modern age arrived, these western voyages were fragments. Maps hinted at them, ruins whispered of them, legends preserved them. Yet the living voice was gone. You hear not the crash of oars, not the roar of waves, but only the hush of forgotten shores. If you're still listening, notice how forgetting is not sudden. It comes like snow, drifting slowly, covering paths until they are gone. A wider pattern and so, the Viking journeys across the Atlantic remind us of more than ships and sails. They remind us how fragile even the strongest seeming ventures can be. Climate shifts, distance lengthens, conflicts rise, silence spreads. What was once full of voices becomes empty. Yet, in that emptiness, something lingers. The ruins, the sagas, the names, Vinland, it's Greenland. They remain, fragile echoes of what once was. You don't have to remember each detail. Just let the rhythm of rise and fall drift through you. Civilizations, like waves, advance, break, retreat, leave only foam. Re-anchor reef. you're still listening, notice how your own sense of time feels slower now. The sagas, the journeys, the silences, they are not rushing. They move as slowly as embers cooling, as snow drifting. You don't have to hold them tightly. Just let them rest, let them pass, let them fade into the hush. Reflection, the Norse did not know they were living their final winters on Greenland. To them, each year was another struggle, another hope for spring, and then silence. You wonder softly, when people leave, when voices fade, what remains? Is it the ruins, the bones, the names carved in stone? Or is it the faint memory of firelight, the whisper of stories told against the dark, the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, a new shore waits? If you're still listening, let that question drift open, unresolved, like a ship sailing into fog, never seen again, yet always imagined. Asterisk, you hear the sound of boots upon frozen ground, not the boots of sailors, but of wanderers, centuries later, picking their way across ruins. The wind whistles low across mounds of turf, stone walls sunk into earth, grass covering what once was living space. The sound of gulls circles overhead, their cries sharp against the emptiness. Somewhere in the distance, waves slap against rock, a rhythm as old as the first oars, and yet, here among the ruins, no voices rise. The halls are gone, the fire's out. What remains are shapes, low stone outlines, fragments of walls, shards of bone buried in soil. The saga said much, but here the land says little. You don't have to solve the silence, just listen to it as it folds in around the stones like fog settling in valleys. Archaeology of absent centuries after the Greenlanders vanished. Explorers and scholars began to wonder what happened. When ships from Denmark reached the coasts again in the early 1700s, they found no Norsemen waiting. Instead, they found Inuit thriving in the same cold, skilled in ways the Norse never mastered, with kayaks, harpoons, fur clothing. The Norse settlements were only ghosts. You hear the scraping of a spade in frozen soil. A man bends, pulls away earth, and uncovers a bone. Another finds a church foundation. Bit by bit, evidence emerges, but always incomplete, always fragmented. Archaeology of this kind is not loud. It is the brushing away of dust, the lifting of small stones, the reading of marks carved long ago. You don't need to imagine every artifact. Just notice how each discovery feels like a faint whisper, rising briefly, then fading again. Sagas as guides, the sagas, though written in the 1200s and 1300s, lived on. They told of Leif, of Gudrid, of Vinland. Scholars read them, sailors speculated, dreamers wondered if America itself had been known before Columbus. Picture a scholar in candlelight. Pages spread before him, ink stains on his fingers. He frowns, tracing the names: Helluland, Markland, Vinland. Where were these? Could they be mapped to Labrador, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia? The sagas are not maps. They are rivers of memory. Yet they hint, they gesture, they whisper of lands across the sea. If you're still listening, you don't need to fix them on a chart. It's enough to imagine the candle flickering, the scholar pausing, listening almost as if he could still hear the voice of a skald from centuries before. Lawns, meadows, and then, in the 20th century, something remarkable. On the tip of Newfoundland, excavators uncovered a Norse site: turf walls, iron nails, a spindle whorl, the kind of evidence that breathed life into the sagas. Imagine walking there at dusk. The wind sweeps across the grass, the sea glimmers beyond. You step inside the low outlines of houses, dark earth, turf piled high, spaces once warm with fire, now cool and silent. Here, for a brief time, Norse settlers lived. They cut timber, forged iron, mended boats, stored food. For them, this was not legend, but daily life. And yet, it lasted so briefly that it slipped almost entirely from memory. If you're still listening, Notice how this place feels both solid and ghostly, a real ruin, yet tied to sagas that drift between history and dream, echoes in myth beyond archaeology. The journeys lingered in other ways. Some scholars believe faint traces of Vinland appeared in Irish stories, in Inuit legends, in whispers of strangers seen long ago. Each culture remembers differently, shaping memory to its own needs. For Norse descendants, these voyages became symbols of courage. For later Europeans, they became arguments of discovery. For us now, they are reminders of how fragile contact can be, how a few winters on a distant shore can ripple across centuries. You don't have to weigh which version is truer. Just let the overlapping echoes wash through you, one voice saying one thing, another something different, until they blend into a soft chorus, fading into the hush, the persistence of names. Evan. When the settlements vanished, the names remained. Greenland still bore its hopeful title. Iceland still carried its cold, honest one. Vinland lingered in sagas. Names are anchors. They hold against forgetting. They float in memory like driftwood, carried far by currents, still bearing the mark of where they once belonged. Picture a child in Iceland centuries later, hearing the word Vinland. To them, it is not a place, but a sound, a syllable filled with mystery. Perhaps they imagine it as a dreamland, rich with fruits and forests. Perhaps they imagine it as a warning of dangers beyond the sea. And you, listening now, don't have to pin the name to a map. Just hear how it sounds. Vinland, like a song, almost soft, lingering, carrying across water. Read-anchor. If you're still listening, notice how time feels slower now. Stories, ruins, names, they all stretch across centuries. But for you, they pass like gentle waves. You don't need to hold them tightly. Just let them drift, as lightly as leaves carried on water. As lightly as leaves carried on water. The quiet lessons, the Viking journeys across the Atlantic, are often remembered for boldness, for discovery. But their quieter lesson lies in fragility, in how even the strongest ships, the bravest hearts, the fiercest ambitions can be undone by climate, distance, conflict, or silence. And yet, the memory remains, not whole, not certain, but enough to remind us that even when voices vanish, traces linger. A nail in soil, a line in a saga, a name carried across centuries. If you're still listening, let that sense of fragility stay with you. You don't have to decide what matters most. Just imagine the wind moving across ruins, the waves rising and falling, the sagas murmuring faintly in the distance, reflection at the end of this long wandering. You might wonder, did the Norse truly fail in their western voyages, or did they succeed in leaving an echo that is never fully faded? The sagas remain, the ruins remain, the names remain. They are not whole, but perhaps wholeness was never the point. Perhaps journeys are not measured by permanence, but by the way they continue to whisper centuries later in the quiet of the night. And so you drift with that question, unresolved, open. Were these journeys meant to last in stone, or only in memory, carried endlessly by voices, like waves that never cease? Asterisk, you hear the creak of an old quill scratching across parchment. The scribe bends low over the page, candlelight flickering across his fingers. His eyes are tired, the ink dark. He is copying words written long before sagas of Greenland, of voyages west. Each letter takes time, each word fragile, balanced between memory and silence. Outside, wind presses against wooden shutters, carrying with it the faint smell of sea salt. Though the shore lies far away, this is how memory survived, not in bustling settlements or living voices, but in the quiet labor of scribes, in the dim glow of candlelight. Yet even here, silence was stronger. For while sagas were copied, they were not always believed. They slipped into the fog of legend, the weight of forgetting in Europe. Attention turned inward. Wars raged, kingdoms rose and fell. The Black Death swept across lands, thinning populations. Who could spare a thought for Vinland, a land far across stormy seas, mentioned only in stories. Imagine a town crier calling news in a medieval square. Prices of grain, decrees of kings, rumors of battles. There is no mention of inland, no memory of western voyages. Daily survival leaves little room for distant shores. And so, slowly, what was once daring exploration becomes faint. The sagas are read by few. The ruins on Greenland grow overgrown. Even the names drift toward obscurity. If you're still listening, notice how forgetting feels, not like a sudden break, but like fog thickening, covering paths so gently that no one notices when they are gone. Ghost islands on maps said not all was lost. In the age of medieval mapmakers, strange shapes appeared on charts islands that may or may not have existed. Names drawn from whispers of sagas, from sailors' rumors. You picture a great map stretched on a table, pigments of red, blue, and green filling in coasts. The cartographer dips his brush, steady hand, sketching. He has never seen these lands himself. He has only heard. And so, in the ocean west of Iceland, he paints small forms, islands like Hebruzel, St. Brendan's Isle, Markland. The parchment smells faintly of vellum, the colors rich. To those who see these maps, the islands are real. To us, they are echoes of memory. Ghostly shapes drifting between truth and imagination. You don't need to decide which were real. Just let them hover before you, like mirages rising from the sea. Myths of the sea as centuries turned, stories of the ocean itself grew stranger. Sailors told of sea monsters with jaws wide enough to swallow ships, of whirlpools that dragged vessels to the depths, of islands that appeared for a day and vanished by night. Picture a sailor on a moonless seawall lamp, swaying in the cabin. He hears creaks, splashes, groans from the hull. Every sound might be danger. Every shadow might hide a beast. In such a world, the memory of Vinland fit naturally, a land beyond, glimpsed but uncertain, filled with danger and wonder alike. If you're still listening, notice how fear and curiosity blend together, like waves merging with fog, each rising and falling without end. Anchor. If you're still here, let yourself drift in the rhythm. You don't have to follow each detail. The sagas, the maps, the monsters, they pass like waves, slow, steady. It's enough just to hear their cadence, to let the sound fold around you like a cloak. The rediscovery of Greenland by the late Middle Ages. Greenland itself was remembered only faintly. Yet, in 1408, a marriage was recorded at Hvelsey Church, one of the last written traces of Norse life there. After that, silence. Imagine the church now. Stone walls rising above grass, windows empty of glass, roof long gone. The stones are cold, moss creeping over them. A bird perches where once hymns were sung. Visitors, centuries later, walked among these ruins and wondered, where had the people gone? What storms, what famines, what silences swallowed them? No one knew, and you don't need to know either. Just let the image linger. A roofless church under open sky, its walls still whispering prayers no one remembers. Columbus and echoes of sagas when Columbus planned his voyage west in the 1490s. Some believe he had heard rumors of Vinland. The sagas themselves were not widely known in Spain, but whispers carried of land far across the sea, once reached by Norsemen. Imagine Columbus late at night, bent over charts, lantern swinging. He studies wind patterns, tides, stories of sailors. Among them, perhaps faint notes of the saga's drift. Perhaps he hears of land where grapes grew, where timber stood tall. Did it influence him? We cannot be certain, but the possibility is there, like a shadow on water. If you're still listening, notice how memory sometimes works, not as clear truth, but as a half-heard rumor, enough to change the path of history itself. The quiet endurance of sagas. The sagas survived not because they were believed, but because they were loved. They were read in Iceland, told in halls, copied in monasteries. They preserved names like Leif, Gudrid, Eric, the red dot picture, a small farmhouse in Iceland. 1600s. Outside, snowdrifts. Inside, a family gathers. The father reading from a manuscript. His voice is low, steady, words rolling slowly. Children listen with wide eyes. To them, these are not distant histories, but part of their own blood, their own story. And so, even as Europe forgot, the sagas lived in Iceland's long nights, in the hush of winter, in the glow of lamp flames. If you're still listening, let that image linger. A family gathered in shadow, a voice reading, words carrying the memory of seas once crossed. Re-anchor. Again, you're still with me. Notice how your own breath has slowed. The sagas, the maps, the ruins, they move gently like waves that never hurry. You don't need to hold the thread. You don't need to recall the names. It's enough to rest in the sound, to feel the way time stretches and softens. Reflection by the close of the Middle Ages. The Norse voyages were not entirely forgotten, yet not fully remembered. They existed in fragments, ruins on Greenland, faint names on maps, sagas in Icelandic script. Whispers in Europe. They were not history in the modern sense. They were half memory, half dream, and perhaps that is why they continue to hold us now. For what lingers in half-light has a power of its own. And so, you might wonder, is it better to be remembered clearly, or to be remembered faintly like a song half heard, like ruins in the mist, like sails glimpsed once and then gone? If you're still listening, let that question drift softly, unresolved, as if carried away on waves toward a horizon you cannot see. Asterisk, you hear the whisper of wind across a museum floor. The room is hushed, the air cool, the echo of footsteps softened by stone walls. Inside, glass cases, live fragments, iron nails, spindle whorls, carved wood. To some, they look ordinary. To others, they are doorways. Each artifact carries with it the faint pulse of a vanished voyage, the faint breath of lives lived on the edge of the sea. And so, centuries after the last Norse voices faded from Greenland, their journeys began to return. Not in songs by firelight, not in sagas alone, but in the measured tone of historians, in the quiet work of archaeologists, in the imagination of those who wondered what lay beyond the maps of the known world. What lay beyond the maps of the known world? The age of rediscovery. By the 19th century, Europe was swept by Romanticism. Ruins were no longer seen as empty, but as haunted and beautiful. Sagas were translated, printed, shared, what had once been obscure. Icelandic manuscripts became stories told across Europe and America. Imagine a scholar in Copenhagen, spectacles perched low, poring over vellum manuscripts brought from Iceland. The ink is faded, but still legible. He traces each word, then carefully transcribes it into modern script. His study smells of paper and candle wax. Outside, carriages rattle on cobbled streets, but inside, silence holds. He pauses, often, picturing the voyage's Leif, stepping ashore in Vinland, Gudrid gazing westward, ships pressing against the wind. These images are not just scholarship, they are a rekindling. If you're still listening, you don't need to follow every name. Just let the image of scholars in dim rooms drift past men and women, uncovering forgotten words, giving them new voice. The pull of America across the Atlantic. In the growing United States, the saga stirred special fascination. To Americans, the thought that Norsemen reached their shores centuries before Columbus was powerful. It gave a sense of deeper roots, of ancient contact. In towns from Boston to Milwaukee, monuments were raised to Leif Erikson. Poems were written, songs sung, lectures delivered for immigrants of Scandinavian descent. These stories were not only history, but heritage. It's proof that their ancestors had touched the New World long ago. Imagine a parade in the crisp air of autumn. Children wave flags, banners proclaim Leif the Lucky. A statue of a Viking stands tall, bronze sword raised. The crowd cheers, though most have never seen the sagas themselves. Here, the voyages are not only remembered, they are celebrated, woven into identity. And yet, beneath the bronze and banners, the question remains, what truly happened in Vinland? How far west did they go? What did they build, and why did they leave? You don't need to answer. Just notice how memory itself can change, becoming what people need it to be, as fluid as the sea. The archaeologists arrive in the mid-20th century. Archaeology gave memory its strongest anchor at Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland. Excavators, Helge and Anne Stein, Ingstad, uncovered Norse turf houses, ironworking sites, spindle whorls. Picture the moment of discovery. A shovel scraping earth, the smell of damp soil rising, a hand brushing dirt from a stone wall. Slowly, the outline of a house emerges, long, low, thick with turf. Inside, fragments of life are found, a bronze pen, a bone needle. Each piece is small, yet each carries the weight of proof. The sagas were not only stories, they had roots in reality. Finland had existed, only for a brief time. You hear the voices of archaeologists murmuring in excitement, the clicking of cameras, the scratching of pens across notebooks, but beneath their words lies something quieter, the sense of time folding, of centuries opening to reveal what had been hidden. If you're still listening, let that image linger, ruins uncovered from soil, rising like memories from silence. Reankarif, you're still here. Notice how the rhythm has slowed again. You don't need to recall each date, each name. The sagas, the excavations, the parades, they pass like waves, steady, unhurried. It's enough to drift with the cadence, to let time feel slower, softer, memory in stone and story today. You can walk among the reconstructed turf houses at Lance O Meadows. The walls are thick, the rooms dim, the air smelling of grass and earth. A fire burns faintly in a hearth, its smoke curling upward, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the room. You hear the crack of wood, the hush of wind outside. For a moment, it feels as if the settlers never left, as if Leif himself might step through the door, but step outside, and you see only the Atlantic stretching vast, waves rolling endlessly, the wind cold and sharp. The world has moved on, but the ruins remain, quiet reminders of a time when Norse ships pressed farther than anyone else dared. If you're still listening, let that quietness settle in you, like the hush of waves against distant shores. What remains in memory, the Viking voyages across the Atlantic, are remembered now in many ways. Hey, in statues, in sagas, in ruins, in textbooks. Some see them as bold adventures, others as fragile failures, others as whispers of contact with a wider world. But beyond interpretation, what lingers most is atmosphere, the sense of men and women pressing into fog, hearing only wind and waves, not knowing if they would ever return. The courage, the hunger, the fear, all folded into silence. And so, when you think of them now, you don't need to choose one meaning. You can simply rest in the mystery that people once crossed oceans with no compass, guided only by stars, stories, and hope. The final reflection history often tells of empires, battles, victories, but the story of Vinland and Greenland is quieter. It is about small settlements, brief winters, forgotten graves, whispered sagas. It is about the fragility of human effort against distance, climate, and time. And yet, in their very fragility lies their power. For even now, centuries later, we still speak their names. We still wonder what they saw, how far they went, why they left. Their silence has become our curiosity. You hear again the sound of waves, slow, steady, endless. They are the same waves that carried Norse ships west, the same waves that whispered against empty shores, the same waves that still roll tonight. If you're still listening, Notice how the story itself feels like those waves, never abrupt, never rushed, always flowing, always fading, always returning. And you might wonder softly, are the voyages over? Or do they continue, still in memory, in story, in the quiet pool of the sea that never ends, that never ends?